The night she arrived at the Dunmore plantation, the wind carried a sound that did not belong to the living. Lantern flames bowed low, as if afraid to stand upright, and the horses refused to step closer until the driver struck them hard enough to echo through the pines. In the back of the wagon sat a girl, small, silent, covered in burlap and dust, her wrists bound with rope that looked unnecessarily tight for someone who hadn't made a single attempt to run. The men expected tears. They expected trembling. They expected the vacant stare beaten into so many who had passed through those same wooden gates. But she lifted her head instead, slowly, like someone rising from dark water, and the foreman swore under his breath that her eyes reflected the lantern light in a way no human eyes should. He would later insist that the moment she looked at him, every sound, the insects, the wind, even the rustling of the trees, fell dead still for just one breath. Everyone on the plantation knew she had come from a line of violent owners. 8 masters before this one had tried to control her, break her, bury her spirit under orders and punishments. Yet the stories that drifted behind her lacked the usual shape of suffering. They were jagged, mismatched tales of accidents and disappearances, men who lost their minds, and families who whispered that she carried something dangerous inside her, not rage, but something colder, older, and infinitely more patient. No one said these things out loud now. Not when the new master stood on the porch with a smug smile, confident he would succeed where 8 others had failed. He looked at her as if she were a troublesome animal he could tame with the right leash. But while the men untied her hands, she kept staring at the master, her expression unreadable. The foreman felt a chill roll down his spine, because for the first time, he wondered if the men on the porch had any idea what he had just invited into his home. When she finally stepped onto Arkansas soil, the world seemed to hold its breath. And somewhere deep in the house, behind locked doors the servants never touched, something shifted, as if waking to recognize an equal. She was born in the cramped, airless corner of a slave cabin where the walls leaked rainwater, and the midwife whispered prayers that no one else could hear. The night sky above Arkansas was pulsing with thunder, as if the storm had chosen that moment to split open the world just enough for her to slip through. The other women present would later say that the lightning struck so close it made the entire cabin shake, and for a second the room glowed white, illuminating the newborn in a way that made their breath catch. No one mentioned it out loud, but every woman there felt the same small tremor of fear crawl up their spine, the kind that comes when nature behaves as though it recognizes something important. Her mother, exhausted and trembling, clutched the child to her chest, but even she sensed something different. The infant didn't cry the way newborns were supposed to cry. Instead of wailing, she released a low, steady sound that seemed to hum beneath the roaring storm, almost in harmony with it. The midwife, who had delivered more children than she could count, paused with her hands still slick with birth, staring at the girl's dark, unblinking eyes. For a moment, she felt as though she were being watched by something that had lived longer than a few seconds. The midwife crossed herself out of instinct, even though she practiced 2 different religions depending on the day and the company she kept. Word of the storm-born child traveled through the quarters faster than the thunder faded. The older slaves, those whose backs had bent under decades of labor, whispered that children born in storms carried a shadow, a gift, or a warning. Some believed the sky marked people at birth, choosing who would suffer quietly and who would make the world tremble in return. Others muttered that the girl had arrived under a sign that would not bring peace to anyone who tried to claim her. Yet even with their unease, no one imagined how deeply her presence would carve itself into the lives around her. From her first breath, there seemed to be an invisible distance between her and the world, like a thin veil she had not fully passed through. She watched everything with an intensity far too focused for a child, eyes following movement long before she learned to crawl. When the cabin door creaked or shadows shifted across the floor, she always turned her head toward them, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The women caring for her pretended not to notice this odd behavior, but they exchanged glances they didn't dare speak about in front of the overseers, sensing that the storm had delivered more than just another life into their already burdened world. By the time she reached 9 years old, most children on the plantation had already learned the silent rules of survival: lower your gaze, follow commands before they're spoken, and swallow fear until it becomes part of the bones. But she never adopted the instinctive flinch that lived in the muscles of the others. She moved with a quiet steadiness, neither defiant nor obedient, simply observing the world as if it were a puzzle she had been studying long before she learned to walk. Her first master noticed this immediately. He prided himself on breaking spirits with a single look, yet hers never bent, never even rippled. What unsettled him wasn't her strength, children could be strong, it was her calmness, a calm that did not belong to a girl who had already seen so much cruelty. He watched her from a distance at first, the way she carried buckets larger than her arms should manage, or how she stood perfectly still when the whip cracked near the others. She blinked rarely, and when she did, it was slow, deliberate, as if she were choosing whether or not to acknowledge the world in front of her. During punishments, while other children sobbed or bit their lips until they bled, she only stared straight ahead, not out of rebellion but out of something deeper, something unshaken. The overseers joked that she had ice in her veins, but the master felt something closer to dread whenever her eyes met his. It was during one of those routine beatings, someone else's mistake, not hers, that he realized just how unnatural her composure was. The crack of the lash echoed across the yard, and instead of turning away, she slowly lifted her gaze and locked onto the master. Not with hatred, not with fear, but with an unreadable stillness that made his chest tighten. He looked away first, a small but undeniable victory for a child who had not spoken a word to him in months. That night, he drank twice his usual amount and muttered to his wife that the girl watched him like she was waiting for something. The fear deepened when he began waking in the early hours of the morning, sweating, convinced someone was standing in the corner of his room. Each time he lit a lamp, the space was empty, yet he couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. He blamed her. He couldn't explain why, not rationally, but whenever he passed her in the fields or near the cabins, he felt the same cold prickle crawl up his spine. Other children avoided her too, without knowing why. They whispered that she never jumped at loud noises and never cried when she was hurt, as if pain passed through her without leaving a trace. The master didn't understand her, and what he couldn't understand, he began to fear, sensing that beneath her silence lay something he could never control. The morning the field accident happened began like any other, with the overseer stomping across the rows, shouting orders thick with impatience. The sun hadn't fully risen, and a heavy fog clung to the crops, muting the world in a gray stillness. She was gathering fallen stalks near the old thresher, her hands moving steadily, when the overseer spotted her. He had always despised the quiet way she worked, as if she owed him neither fear nor attention. That day, perhaps irritated by the fog or a restless dream he'd had the night before, he singled her out with a cruel smirk stretching across his face. His voice cut through the silence, mocking her for being slow, though she was moving faster than the others. When she didn't respond, the overseer strode toward her, gripping his cane with the kind of anticipation that burned behind his eyes. She lifted her head slowly, meeting his gaze with that same unnerving calm that had unsettled so many before him. He hated that look, hated how it made him feel small, hated that it made the air around him colder. He raised the cane, ready to bring it down across her back, when the thresher beside them let out a loud grinding sound, as if gears were shifting without being touched. The machine had been broken for weeks, left near the edge of the field until someone had time to repair it. No one had gone near it that morning. The overseer froze, momentarily distracted, glancing toward the noise with irritation. What happened next blurred in the memories of those who saw it from across the field. One moment the overseer was shouting at her to get away from the machine, and the next, his foot slipped on mud that hadn't been there seconds before. He staggered forward, reaching out to steady himself, but his hand caught the edge of the thresher. The machine lurched violently, gears snapping to life, pulling him in with a horrifying force that seemed impossible for something supposed to be broken. His scream sliced through the fog, sending birds scattering from the trees. Workers dropped their tools, rushing forward, but by the time they reached him, the overseer was already mangled beyond saving. She stood a few steps away, untouched, still holding the bundle of stalks in her hands. Her expression didn't change, she didn't gasp or look away. She simply watched as if observing something inevitable. Some said the fog around her seemed thicker, darker, almost swirling. Others swore they saw her step back before anyone else could move, as if she had expected the entire moment. But no matter what version of the story spread, everyone agreed on one thing: when the overseer died, she didn't flinch, didn't blink, and didn't show the slightest trace of fear, leaving those who witnessed the accident with an unspoken certainty that the girl had not been surprised at all. When she was sold to her second master, the journey alone felt like a punishment carved out of miles. The wagon creaked through Arkansas backroads, its wheels sinking into soft earth as if the land itself resisted carrying her any farther. The trader who transported her avoided speaking to her, kept glancing over his shoulder as though expecting her to whisper something unnatural into the quiet. She never did. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, watching the trees bend and sway as if they were leaning closer to see who was passing through. By the time they arrived at the new plantation, the trader looked more relieved than anyone had ever seen him, as if he had been escorting something dangerous rather than a thin, silent girl of barely 10. The second master was a man who valued order above all else, with a household run on strict schedules, polished floors, and the kind of discipline that made servants walk with their eyes fixed downward. At first, he believed she would be easy to manage, quiet, small, obedient in appearance. She was given a narrow bed in the servants' quarters and assigned to clean tools and carry water. But on her first night, the calm rhythm of the house shifted. Strange noises began echoing through the hallways after dark, faint scraping sounds like fingernails dragging across wood, or whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The servants blamed mice or loose shutters, but the noises always stopped the moment she opened her eyes. Within a week, chickens began disappearing from their coop without any sign of blood or tracks, as if they had simply dissolved into the air. Tools hung neatly on walls would fall in the middle of the night, clattering loud enough to rattle windows. Once, the master woke to find his boots set neatly outside his door even though he remembered leaving them downstairs, small, unsettling reminders that something was subtly rearranging the order he clung to so fiercely. Whenever she was punished, the disturbances grew worse. A lamp would flicker violently until the flame died, no matter how much oil it held. Windows slammed during windless nights, and doors creaked open even after being latched shut. The master's wife insisted the girl brought a chill into every room she entered, a coldness that lingered even after she stepped out. Servants complained that the air around her felt heavier, as though the house itself held its breath when she walked by. Still, she never spoke of the noises or the missing animals or the tools that seemed to move on their own. She only watched, silent as ever, while the household grew restless. And in the uneasy quiet that settled over the plantation, the master began to realize that whatever haunted his home had arrived the same day she did, slipping into the house with her as easily as a shadow following its source. The third master who bought her was a wealthy merchant known for his temper and his unwavering belief that any spirit, no matter how stubborn, could be broken. He arrived at the market with a list of traits he wanted in a young servant: obedient, quiet, easily controlled. When he saw her, standing small and expressionless among louder, trembling children, he assumed her silence was submission. The trader didn't warn him. He didn't need to. The faint unease in the merchant's eyes when she glanced at him should have been enough, but pride often blinds a man before danger does. He purchased her with a dismissive wave, confident he could mold her into whatever he wanted. The merchant's home in town was large, cluttered with expensive furniture and artifacts he boasted about to every guest. It was the kind of place filled with heavy curtains that swallowed sound and long hallways that seemed to echo even when no one walked through them. On her first night there, she was given a pallet in a small storage room beside the servants' quarters, and the merchant inspected her as though she were another one of his acquisitions. He demanded that she speak, but she only looked at him with those steady, unblinking eyes that made his throat tighten. He left her with a scowl, muttering threats under his breath. The atmosphere in the house began shifting immediately. Servants whispered that the shadows seemed darker, as if corners of the rooms had deepened overnight. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. The merchant dismissed their concerns and blamed their nerves on the weather, but even he couldn't explain why the candles in his study flickered whenever she passed by or why the house grew strangely cold in rooms she entered. The night he disappeared was marked by a storm that rolled over the town with a force that rattled every windowpane. Rain hammered the roof, and thunder cracked so loudly it seemed to split the walls. At some point after midnight, the merchant's wife woke to an awful silence, a sudden, unnerving quiet that followed a final thunderclap. She called out for her husband, but the house swallowed her voice. When servants searched for him at dawn, they found his bedroom door locked from the inside. After forcing it open, they discovered the room empty. No signs of forced exit, no open window, no footprints on the soaked ground outside. Only the merchant's pocket watch rested on the floor, still ticking. She was found seated calmly in the corner of the same room, her palms resting on her knees, her clothes perfectly dry despite the storm. She didn't say a word, didn't offer an explanation, didn't show the slightest confusion. Some insisted she couldn't have locked the door from inside without leaving. Others argued she had been waiting there long before the merchant vanished. But one thing every servant agreed on: when they saw her in that room at dawn, her expression wasn't frightened or surprised. It was as if she had simply been watching the end of something that had been inevitable from the moment she arrived. The fourth master who claimed her was a plantation owner known for his severity, a man who believed discipline was the backbone of his authority. He inspected her with cold eyes the day she arrived, already annoyed by the murmurs surrounding her past. To him, stories of accidents and disappearances were nothing more than exaggerated excuses for incompetence. He valued control above all else, and he viewed her as a test of his reputation. From the moment she stepped onto his land, he made it clear that disobedience would not be tolerated. But she didn't challenge him. She didn't speak or resist. She simply watched, calm and silent, as if measuring the world around her with a patience that unsettled even the most hardened workers. He assigned her to tasks normally given to older, stronger servants, hauling firewood, carrying buckets of water, scrubbing floors until they shone. Whenever she completed a chore faster than expected, he grew irritated, convinced she was mocking him in some quiet, deliberate way. He struck her the first time after she accidentally spilled water at his feet. It wasn't a serious blow, not the kind that left visible marks, but his hand trembled afterward, though he would never admit it. She didn't react, not even with a flinch, which only deepened his discomfort. That night, he rubbed his palm as though something cold had seeped into his bones when he touched her. Within days, he began feeling sharp pains in his legs, the kind that crawled up from his ankles to his knees whenever she entered the room. He dismissed it as overwork, but the sensations grew worse each time he punished her. Servants noticed that he staggered occasionally, gripping the edge of a table for support while glaring at her as though she were deliberately causing it. She kept her eyes on him, unblinking, unfazed, as though silently observing the gradual unraveling of his body. The shift became unmistakable a week later. He struck her again for a minor mistake, and the moment his hand connected with her skin, his fingers curled involuntarily, locking in place. A wave of numbness traveled up his arm so quickly he gasped. By nightfall, he couldn't lift his right hand at all. By the next morning, the numbness had spread to his shoulder. He raged and blamed everyone except himself, refusing to acknowledge the cold terror growing in his mind each time he saw her standing nearby, watching him with those steady eyes. When he finally collapsed in the middle of the parlor, his body half paralyzed, only one person was present, her. She stood over him with a calmness that made even the strongest servant refuse to enter the room. He tried to speak, to order her away, but the words died on his tongue. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was her expression, still and unreadable, as though she understood exactly what was happening to him, as though she had been waiting for this moment since the day he laid his hands on her. When her fifth master acquired her, he did so not out of necessity but ambition. He had heard the rumors, every version twisted, doubted, or whispered behind cupped hands, but instead of fear, he felt a strange fascination. He was a man obsessed with power, someone who believed he understood the weak and the broken, someone who thought he could bend anyone to his will with the right pressure. But he also saw opportunity in her. In his mind, any slave who could unsettle multiple households might be the perfect weapon to ignite the rebellion he had long fantasized about leading. He imagined himself a legend, a man who rose above his peers through fear and force, and he believed she could be the spark that would make the enslaved rise under his command. He mistook her silence for smothered fury and her calmness for dormant rage he could mold to suit his purpose. From the moment she arrived, he dragged her into rooms where he charted maps and whispered plans, urging her to speak, to confess a desire for vengeance he was convinced she carried. She said nothing. She simply observed him, eyes drifting over his diagrams and tools, watching the way he paced, the way his hands trembled with excitement when he spoke about war and fire. He grew frustrated with her stillness, interpreting her silence as resistance. He became harsher, more demanding, pushing her to show emotion, to reveal some glimpse of anger or loyalty. Instead, she absorbed every demand without blinking, leaving him unnerved by the feeling that he was the one being studied. At night, he gathered the guards and trusted field workers, attempting to recruit them into his imagined uprising. But something strange began happening during those meetings. Men who had followed him for years suddenly grew restless, snapping at each other without reason. They claimed they heard whispers behind them, soft voices urging them to distrust the others. Several men swore they heard her voice specifically, calling their names though she had never spoken a word to any of them. One guard fled from the house entirely, running into the woods until he collapsed from exhaustion, insisting she had been standing behind him in the dark even though she had not left her quarters. The master blamed them all for cowardice, furious that his plans were crumbling. He confronted her late one night, pacing in front of her while demanding answers she had no intention of giving. His anger grew into something frantic, almost desperate. He wanted her loyalty, her fury, her obedience, anything that would make her fit into the narrative he had built around her. But as he shouted, the guards behind him began shifting uneasily, glancing at one another with fear that had nothing to do with him. They no longer saw a leader. They saw a man unraveling. The tension snapped suddenly. One guard lunged, not at her, but at the master himself. Within seconds the room erupted into chaos, men shouting, turning on him as if some invisible thread had pulled them toward violence. He fell to the floor, overwhelmed by the very men he had tried to command. In the midst of the confusion, she remained perfectly still, untouched, watching with that same eerie calm. And when the fighting stopped, every man swore they had acted out of their own terror, convinced the master had become the threat. Not one of them questioned how she had stood in the center of that storm without ever being struck, as if the chaos had known better than to touch her. Her sixth master was unlike the others in one crucial way: he didn't buy her for labor or punishment. He bought her out of curiosity. He was a doctor, educated, analytical, a man who believed every human behavior could be explained if studied closely enough. When he heard the stories surrounding her, masters falling ill, disappearing, losing control of their own men, he dismissed them as superstition layered over coincidence. He believed she was an anomaly that could be dissected with reason, a mind shaped by trauma and silence, nothing more. He welcomed her into his home with a calm smile, convinced he was the first man capable of understanding her. He began by observing her from a distance, taking notes in a leather-bound journal that never left his desk. He wrote down how long she could stand motionless, how her breathing barely changed even after hours of work, how her eyes followed him with unsettling precision. Instead of punishing her silence, he leaned into it, prompting her gently with questions he didn't expect her to answer. He believed he was unraveling her mystery, attributing her stillness to a survival mechanism rather than something unnatural. Yet the longer he studied her, the more the edges of his certainty began to fray. At night, when the house settled into its quietest hours, he heard faint footsteps outside his study, slow and measured. He would open the door, expecting to find a servant or perhaps a wandering patient, but the hallway remained empty. Once, he could have sworn he saw a small shadow pause at the corner before slipping out of sight, though he found her asleep in her room moments later. The more he tried to rationalize these moments, the more restless he became. He began writing faster, filling pages with contradictions, praising her composure in one line and calling it predatory in the next. He attempted controlled experiments, testing her reactions to loud sounds, sudden movements, or emotional triggers. Nothing worked. She remained entirely unaffected. He documented her heartbeat and found it lower than any child's he had ever examined, steady as a drumbeat, never rising, not even when startled. The discovery disturbed him more than he admitted. His sleep grew shallow, riddled with dreams he couldn't recall but woke from trembling. His handwriting, once neat and elegant, devolved into jagged scribbles warning himself to stop, to step back, to breathe. His final spiral began when he woke one night to the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He snapped upright, breath-catching, and saw her standing in the moonlit doorway of his room. She didn't move or speak, just stared with that unblinking calm he once believed he could interpret. When he lit the lamp, she was gone, vanished so quickly it made his heart pound. By morning, he could barely hold his pen. His journal entries turned into frantic pleas written to no one, lines repeating, "She knows. She sees everything." Within a week, his mind had unraveled completely. He locked himself in his study, muttering to the shadows, insisting she wasn't a girl at all but something wearing the shape of one. Servants found him 3 days later, sitting on the floor in a trembling heap, unable to speak, unable to look at her without shuddering. Whatever certainty he once held had broken apart, leaving him hollow and terrified, while she remained as silent and steady as ever, untouched by the chaos she had quietly left in her wake. Her seventh master was a man consumed by religion, a zealot who believed the world was divided into the righteous and the possessed, and that anyone who defied authority must carry a darkness inside them. When he acquired her, he did so with the conviction that she was a vessel of evil that needed to be purged. He built a small room in the back of his house, lit by candles, and filled it with crosses, holy water, and the remnants of rituals he had performed on animals and servants alike. From the moment she arrived, he spoke of her as if she were already damned, warning the other workers to guard their souls against her influence. She did not respond. She did not flinch. She simply followed orders, her eyes calm and unwavering, observing him as though he were the anomaly in a world she already understood. The zealot began his attempts to cleanse her almost immediately. He recited prayers, sprinkled water, and called upon spirits he believed would protect the household from her presence. He shouted and shook, declaring that he would expose the evil that lived behind her calm exterior. Yet each ritual seemed only to strengthen the unease in the house. The candles would flicker violently, shadows would twist unnaturally on the walls, and objects he placed to enforce his dominion over the space, small statues, iron charms, even books, would topple or vanish without explanation. He blamed drafts, nerves, even servants' carelessness, but deep down he began to recognize a pattern he could not control or comprehend. During the most elaborate exorcism he attempted, he tied her hands and knees and circled her with chants meant to expel demons. Sweat poured down his face, and his voice cracked as he demanded that the darkness leave her body. In the center of the room, he suddenly convulsed, clutching at his chest and gagging on words he could not finish. Servants rushed to intervene, but the air itself seemed to resist them, holding him down as he thrashed. When he collapsed onto the floor, gasping and unable to rise, she remained perfectly still, her calm radiating through the chaos like an impossible anchor. Not one drop of sweat, not one shiver betrayed her presence, yet every living soul in the room felt the weight of something far older and far colder than human authority. After that night, the zealot no longer dared to confront her directly. He muttered prayers under his breath, avoided her gaze, and eventually retreated to private quarters, insisting to himself that her evil was beyond anything he had ever encountered. The servants whispered that she had not only survived his wrath but had somehow turned it back upon him, leaving him broken in spirit without touching her. Even as he locked himself away and refused to leave his study for days, she continued her duties with the same quiet precision she had always displayed, untouched by fear or force. The house settled into an uneasy rhythm, one in which her presence was simultaneously indispensable and terrifying, a reminder that the darkness he sought to destroy had always existed quietly, watching, waiting, and entirely beyond his control. Her eighth master was a man whose wealth and arrogance rivaled the legends whispered across Arkansas plantations. He believed that money, influence, and fear could bend any will, and when he purchased her, he saw himself as the final authority who could conquer what 8 others had failed to control. He arrived with an entourage, confident in his power, and assessed her with the same condescending gaze he applied to livestock and property alike. He made no effort to hide his belief that she would bend to his orders, that her silence and composure were simply untested limits. Yet from the moment she stepped onto his land, the air seemed to shift subtly, as if acknowledging that the balance of power had already been altered before a single command was spoken. She moved through the mansion quietly, performing chores and attending to the household without complaint, yet there was a precision in her movements that unnerved everyone. Servants noticed that doors she passed would click shut behind her, locks fastening themselves, lamps flickering in her wake. Guards swore that their weapons felt heavier when she approached, that a chill would run down their spines even in the sweltering heat. She spoke no word of complaint or ambition, yet a subtle authority began to ripple outward from her, a presence the household could not name but could not ignore. Slowly, she became the axis around which the entire estate turned, whether anyone admitted it or not. The 8th master attempted every method he had relied upon before: threats, physical punishment, manipulation, even feigned kindness. Each effort was met with the same calm, unreadable expression, an imperviousness that chipped away at his patience and pride. Meanwhile, she began influencing the servants, the guards, and even family members without overt action, planting ideas with a glance, a pause, a carefully measured nod. Where he sought control, she inspired allegiance, not through speech but through the quiet authority that seemed to emanate from her very being. By the time the master realized his influence was waning, the household no longer obeyed him, they obeyed her. He grew frantic, attempting to assert dominance, only to find himself isolated in his own mansion. The servants subtly undermined him, the guards questioned his orders in private, and even his own family hesitated when he raised his voice. Every attempt to reclaim control backfired in ways that defied reason, leaving him weaker with each confrontation. She observed quietly, never stepping beyond the roles assigned to her, yet orchestrating the shift in power with an uncanny subtlety. In essence, the very man who had purchased her to serve his will had become a servant in his own home, a prisoner to the unspoken authority of the girl who had endured more masters than anyone could count and emerged untouched, untouchable, and absolute in her silent dominion.